Two large yellow letters IN with blue broken up letters spelling visible underneath make up the logo invisible.
The following is the full interview with Kelly Given, recorded during the filming of the documentary Invisible in April 2022, funded by the British Academy. Directed by Dr. Anica Zeyen and Wadeby. Interview conducted by Dr. Anica Zeyen. The text disappears and we meet Kelly. Kelly has long hair and wears glasses. She wears a black and white checkered dress and a pink jacket. She sits in front of an office background.
So my name is Kelly, I am 24 and I am the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager for the NHS Lothian mass vaccination programme. So I was late diagnosed aged 23 with autism and ADHD with a sprinkling of dyspraxia as well, so a bit of a mix. I went through a lot of misdiagnosis. I was misdiagnosed 5 times before I finally uncovered the truth myself. Actually, I researched it and found it myself. Took it to my doctor and then was diagnosed at the age of 23. I have supersonic hearing, like literally, and it's something I actually was laughing about recently because I read an article about it. There's this noise in my flat that I hear all the time that nobody else can hear. My flatmate's like, Kelly, what are you talking about? There is no noise. And I'm like, there is a noise. And I read this thing recently, and apparently autistic people can hear electricity, and it's like it's quite a normal thing to have like really, really sensitive hearing. So yeah, I can hear things for like miles. I think what people really misunderstand about neurodivergence is that the minute I step out the house in the morning, my experience is much different to someone who is neurotypical, and from the minute that I step out the front door, I am constantly having to evaluate my surroundings and make plans in case there's an unexpected noise or there's an unexpected smell or there's something that I can't escape from. So I have to, when I pack my bag in the morning, I pack earplugs and headphones and spare headphones and phone chargers and spare phone chargers because I need to be able to regulate my sensory input. So every day is challenging because the world was not built for my neurotype. So yeah, I guess that's the difference. I think the biggest challenge that I'm up against is the fact that spaces are not designed for me at all. When I go to the workplace, there is nothing there for me at all. We're looking at more accessible workspaces, and we had people come into our place of work to make them more inclusive. And what they did with that was make them open plan and everyone hot desked, and that makes it less inclusive for people who are neurodivergent. So I think the one thing I could ask for is to just be more mindful that not everybody is the same, not everybody thinks the same, not everybody benefits in the same way, to just be flexible in your practices in anything that you do. I just think act with compassion. I think that's the basis of it all. Think about other people and embrace everyone's differences.
How did your diagnosis make you feel?
I can't explain the relief that brought me because I struggled immensely for years. There was a lot of challenges. I was made homeless twice in that throughout the journey, and my relationships with my parents were really fractured, with my friends, everyone close to me. I was very isolated. I didn't do well at school, even though I should have done. I didn't do well at work. I couldn't make sense of anything, and it felt very much like I was just failing all the time and nobody was giving me any answers. And no matter what diagnosis I got, so I was getting all these different diagnoses, and I was trying very hard to squeeze myself into these boxes, knowing that I didn't really identify with them because I wanted answers. So when I finally had something in front of me that explained everything, that was so freeing. And it was also, it gave me permission to be kinder to myself and to forgive myself for some of the things that I went through, because I realised that actually those weren't my fault, and yeah, it was just a really freeing experience.
What does your average day look like?
Tend to get up early. I like to do morning yoga. That's one thing I will say is the gym is the only place where my brain gives me a bit of peace to just be myself. I don't feel autistic in that space. I don't feel like I'm really oppressed in that space. It gives me a sense of freedom that I don't get elsewhere, because I can turn my brain off, I can put my headphones in and I can just be myself. So I like to start my day with some yoga or body balance or something like that. It helps me to stay centred. And then I tend to work from home because the office isn't the most accessible. It's open plan, there's a lot of noise. There aren't that many quiet spaces available to me, so I tend to work from home. My home is a flat in Edinburgh. I live with my flatmate, she's a teacher, so she's away all day. I'll just work from home. I tend to do meetings in the morning, get some stuff done in the afternoon. I actually just started my new job, so I'm finding my feet a little bit with that. And then at night time, I like to go for a walk. Another way that I kind of balance my brain out is by going and getting my steps in every day, putting my headphones in, switching off. So yeah, nothing majorly exciting.
What was the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Honestly, I was very ignorant to it. I was in New York when I first heard of the virus, and my immediate thoughts were, "Oh, this is just a virus. It's it's going to come and go. Doesn't affect me at all." Didn't really pay attention to it, and it wasn't. And I remember standing in Times Square and seeing it on the news, and it was a fleeting thought. I just didn't think about it. And then I came back to the UK, and all of a sudden it was this massive thing. And even right up until the very end, I think I was in denial about it. I was like, 'cause it's my birthday is the 26th of March, and we went into lockdown on the 22nd. So right up until that week, I had plans to celebrate my birthday with my friends. So I was very much in denial and like ignoring it because I genuinely didn't understand the magnitude of it. I didn't understand where it was going to go. I didn't for a second think that 2 years down the line we'd still be sitting here dealing with this virus. But when it first started to properly sink in, I was very anxious because I'm asthmatic and vulnerable to that virus in particular. I lived on my own at the time, so the first lockdown was incredibly isolating for me. I spent 3 months on my own. All my family were half an hour away. We were in different counties, so we couldn't even travel to see each other outside. So I found it very difficult. I think actually, in an autism sense, it was quite calming because I wasn't having to interact with people in the same way. I wasn't having to be forced into social interactions all the time. I had my own flat, so there was a lot of quiet, a lot of time to myself. So in that sense, I almost found it enjoyable because I wasn't as stressed. But then you have ADHD on top of that, and ADHD I think was exasperated at that time because I didn't have anyone there to support me. My mum usually comes over every week and like helps me with housework and things, executive functioning things that I find difficult, and she obviously wasn't able to do that. So I was kind of thrust into this like being alone all the time, being responsible for myself all the time, having no help, but also being undiagnosed at that time too. I still didn't know what was wrong or how I could help myself. So there were definitely a few moments throughout that period that I really struggled and had massive meltdowns because I couldn't understand what was going on, and I think that was then compounded by the fact that we were trapped in this situation. It was very stressful. So it was actually during lockdown that I figured out that I was autistic. So my next door neighbour had a party one night, and she'd had a couple, and I was already anxious about the spread of COVID, so that was another factor in it, but the noise was just, I couldn't explain how that made me feel. It was like every time I heard a noise in her flat, I would freak out. I was like pulling, I remember there's one time in particular, I was like pulling my hair, crying, throwing things at the wall. I had an absolute meltdown. And as soon as I stepped outside and I thought, go outside, remove yourself from this situation, I went outside, and as soon as I went outside and I removed myself, I felt immediately better, and something just clicked in my brain that night. It was like, that was sensory overload. You removed yourself, you feel better. That was what that was. And so then I started to implement those coping mechanisms. So whenever something started to trigger me, I went outside or I went to the beach, and I found ways to control it that I do now and that are part of my everyday life. But until that point, I didn't know that I could do that, or that's what was triggering me. So lockdown helped me figure out what was going on.
We saw Kelly walking through the woodlands and across a wooden bridge. Text appears. How did you find the ease of COVID-19 restrictions?
Very challenging. I found it very challenging to go back to normal life. As an autistic person, being thrust back into this, you must now socially interact with all these people because you've not seen them for 3 months, was quite difficult. It was also a very anxious time in terms of being asthmatic and not wanting to catch the virus. But also being vulnerable after being by myself for 3 months and feeling very sort of boxed in and isolated because I hadn't seen anybody, and all of my family and friends none of them were alone, it was just me. So I felt like nobody really understood my experience, and I just remember feeling very isolated, and I found it difficult to go back and forwards. And at the very start of lockdown, there was nothing in place for single person households. It was households or nothing, and I didn't have a household. So to go back to that and to be forced back into being alone after being alone for a very long time was really difficult.
Did you take up any new activities during the pandemic?
I actually lived at the bottom of my stairs. There was an Asda, and at the start of the pandemic, everyone was like bulk buying toilet roll and like queuing outside Asda for hours on end. It was ridiculous. And I thought, I'm going to go and ask if they've got shifts at the weekends and see if I can like do something with my time. And I did, and I went over and I got a job in Asda at the weekends. So I worked from home during the week, went to Asda at the weekends, and I made friends, and it was the best thing I could have done because I got out of the house every day. I got to speak to people. I mean, it put me in a bit of a vulnerable position in terms of catching COVID because that was a hotspot for COVID, but I think it kept me sane throughout those months, and I met 2 friends who I'm still best friends with now and who I still see all the time. And yeah, it was the best thing I could have done. So I applied for an internship, an international internship that was virtual because of COVID, and I was working on it for 3 months on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. I graduated in November last year, and I'm now a policy lead, so I have 10 of my own interns and I teach them UN policy every week. And that's just been a really amazing experience because I've been able to meet with people from all over the world who are passionate about the SDGs, who are passionate about UN work, whilst also making connections at the UN and getting my foot in the door there, because that's always been my dream, is to work there. For example, last year we did a summit over the General Assembly, and I had a one-to-one with the CEO of the Obama Foundation, which was a massive one for me. And when I was 11, not even 11, I'd done a talk on Barack Obama for a speakers competition. So I've loved the Obamas forever, and to meet his former chief political advisor was really incredible. And I've been able to make these connections from my living room, which has been a strange experience, but really, really good. And I'm actually going to the UN next week, so hoping to make the most of those connections that I made during lockdown.
Do you think making these connections was easier for you as it was virtual, or would you have preferred face-to-face?
I think there's pros and cons to both. I think autism, this is the thing, that autism and ADHD work against each other, because in an autistic sense, from the comfort of your own home and conversing like that is much better, because you can kind of please yourself, you can regulate your sensory environment, you're not thrusting into an environment that you can't control. But ADHD has your mind wandering every 2 minutes, so there's been a good few occasions over the last year when I've been on webinars or I've been doing my internship or whatever, and I'm away daydreaming about something else. And so it does work against each other. I think if I could choose, I would probably prefer to be in person, mostly, but then I don't know how much that is because I have taught myself how to mask so well that I feel like I do better in person, and whether I'm actually comfortable in that space or not is different. And I suppose that's stuff that you need to unpack after you're diagnosed at the age of 23. But I think there's pros and cons to both. I don't know if I could 100% say what was best either way.
You just mentioned masking. What are some of your masking behaviours?
So a big one that I try not to do now, but just to honour my own self and my own needs, is forcing myself to have eye contact with people. It's something that you're taught from a very young age, that you should be looking people in the eye, and it shows that you're listening and that you're attentive. And I can't explain to you how uncomfortable it makes me. It makes me want to shrivel out of my skin. And I've always been like that. I've always hated it, but I've never understood why. And I always thought that everyone just hated it and that it was just an uncomfortable thing for everyone to do. But I do find myself, I try very hard to look people in the eye because I know that that's what people expect of me. So I'm trying very hard now to honour that and to not do it. And I have mechanisms, so like I'll look at someone's eyebrows instead of looking at their eyes, just so it looks like I'm looking at them, but I'm not. And I am trying to unpack a lot of that. I think another thing would be trying to think of really obvious masking. Eating is a really big issue for me. Food texture is very difficult. So if I'm in a new environment, for example, eating lunch with a new colleague or anything like that, I tend to put a face on it and I don't make a big deal out of it. But if I'm at home by myself, you wouldn't catch me making those decisions at all. I would be like separating everything on my plate and making sure that everything that I ate was a fine texture and it wouldn't trigger me. There's just a lot of things. I think, like I said previously, the minute I step outside the door in the morning, I have to put a mask on because none of it is built for me. And it's difficult to recognise what is actually a mask and what isn't a mask after 23 years of wearing one. It's part of the post-diagnosis process, I assume.
What is the most positive thing that happened to you over the last couple of years?
The most positive thing was finding my diagnosis and having time to recognise that, having the space to really sit with my symptoms and the things that I was experiencing, because up until that point my life had been very fast-paced and I'd always lived with my family and I couldn't explore my presentations in the same way as when I lived on my own. And it wasn't until I had that sort of quietness and peace to explore my presentations and to sit with them and honour when I felt uncomfortable that I was able to put the pieces together. So I don't think, honestly, without the pandemic I would have found out that I was autistic yet. I think I would still be flailing around looking for answers. So I think that has definitely been a massive positive for me. I also liked the stillness of lockdown and just being able to just pause for a while and to not think about all these responsibilities and to just be present and just be still for a while and not have to constantly put pressure on myself to do things or to go places or do things that make me uncomfortable. I think it just let me reset a lot and to reprioritise what I want and how I feel when I'm in certain situations. It just gave me a lot of space to do that.
What were behaviours of others that made your life more challenging?
I think one thing that really ground my gears was people who didn't live alone, making decisions for people who did live alone. For example, politicians with big families who were making decisions about households and not taking into account that people live on their own and that's very isolating. And the sort of side effect of that was that people who didn't live on their own weren't very understanding about people who did. So it was a lot of like people moaning about their situation and it was a bad situation for everyone, but not being understanding at all of the fact that I was alone and I couldn't go anywhere, couldn't see anyone. It was very isolating and I didn't get a lot of understanding about that. So that really annoyed me. And living in a flat, there was a lot of sort of selfish behaviour from my neighbours. There was a lot of like loud music and parties and things that shouldn't have been happening in a pandemic anyway, but as an autistic person, being trapped in that situation was really stressful because you're trapped in a flat not only away from your family and friends for months on end, but you're trapped in a flat that you are very stressed out in. There's a lot of noise, you can't escape it, you can only go outside once a day. It was a lot to take, so there was definitely a lot of mindless behaviour, I think, that really got on my nerves.
What behaviours did you experience as positive?
One thing I really liked was just the community spirit. Like every Thursday, as someone who works for the NHS, I found the clap for the NHS hollow and strange, but in a way, because I lived on my own, it was the only time in the week that I got outside to like see my neighbours and like speak to people, and I liked the sense of community that brought, and I think it did bring people together in a way that I haven't seen for a long time. I think it also has reshaped how we look at disabilities in the workplace in particular, and how disabled people access life, and I hope that that's taken forward as we emerge from the pandemic. But I've definitely seen a bit of a shift in terms of how people view flexible working and just flexibility generally. I think that's been really positive.
Do you think the pandemic has changed the way people think about disability?
I think, and this is a double-edged sword, because I think on the one hand it's very disappointing to me and very disheartening to me that we've been asking for these things for a very long time and to no availability, and we've been told no over and over again. We've been told that there is no space for flexible working, we can't work from home, we can't have flexible working hours, and then we've seen that change overnight, and it showed that actually we've been able to do this the whole time. We've just chosen not to, and that says a lot about what society thinks about disabled people and how much we're valued as individuals and our needs are valued. But I also think that it's very positive going forward, and although we've missed out until now, it's good that we're finally getting some recognition, and that I think actually there's a benefit to the whole of society, not just disabled people, to flexible working practices and flexibility generally. I think we all, as human beings, function way better than we in a flexible environment than we do in a very rigid environment.
Do you think you were better prepared for the pandemic than non-disabled people?
I think disabled people generally are resilient because we have to be. We are hardwired to be resilient because the world was not built for us, and there is very little effort made to include us, and that comes with its challenges. So I think when you are a disabled person living in a very much non-disabled world, you are resilient anyway. So I would say yes. I think, like I say, we are hardwired to be resilient because we have to be. So I think when we're presented with crises, we probably do adapt a little bit better.
What worries you about the future?
I worry that we're going to go straight back to how we were before. I worry that workplaces are going to go straight back to how they were before. We're going to get back to freezing people out of the workspace, disabled people in particular. There was actually an issue at my own work last week. We have 2 floors in our office that are for us, and the executives took over the top floor, and we're no longer allowed to use it. The top floor is the only place in the building with quiet spaces, so we're risking freezing out neurodivergent people already. That is my biggest fear, is that we go back to a working environment that is based solely on capitalism and that is based solely on productivity and is centred on the neurotypical experience. I think as a society, I don't have much faith in us in terms of how we view disabled people and how we look after disabled people, and so it does worry me that we're going to forget the last 2 years and just go straight back to status quo.
Do you think other parts of your identity impacted your experience of the pandemic?
Being a woman, definitely. I think, we've had Sarah Everard in particular in the last year, particularly gruesome and sobering experience for women everywhere. That was a direct result of COVID restrictions and abuse of police power. And so in terms of my safety, I haven't felt safe. And actually I felt less safe during the pandemic than I would have before, probably as a direct result of that case, because not only did that present an issue with women walking at night, it presented an issue with our trust in the police and our trust in law and how women are treated in that space. And I think there've been less people on the streets, so it has felt more unsafe, especially at night time, to be out and about as a woman. I think definitely being a woman has been challenging in the last 2 years as well.
What excites you about the future?
I am excited to live authentically for the first time, because up until this point, up until the pandemic, I lived a very false life. I lived constantly wearing a mask and not being myself and being uncomfortable, and the pandemic has given me space to really sit with that and to unpack it, and I'm ready now to sort of go back out into the world and experience it as me for the first time and honour my needs whilst enjoying things that I want to enjoy, but doing it in a way that is authentic to me for the very first time. I've never experienced that before, and I'm excited to kick that off when I go to New York, because it'll be my first time being away from the country on my own, and being able to just live for myself rather than trying to squeeze myself into a box that I just don't belong in.
Now that you can become your authentic self, are you worried about how others are going to react to your disclosure of neurodiversity?
Absolutely. I actually had a particularly grim experience with an ex-employer, and at the time I wasn't diagnosed. I have since been diagnosed, and I've been told repeatedly, that they don't agree that that is my diagnosis. They don't agree that's what's wrong. They think that I have anxiety. Not that they are qualified in any means to make those assertions, but being met with that ignorance has been really challenging, and it was actually very difficult to swallow in a way that surprised me, because I thought, I've been through a lot in the last 10 years. I thought that I could kind of handle anything, and that was a big kick in the teeth for me, because I fought very tenaciously for this diagnosis, and I threw everything at it, and I knew that that's what it was, and to be told point blank that's not what it is, you're making that up, and to be gaslit like that was very triggering and took a lot of unpacking. And I'm under no illusions. I absolutely think that I'm going to be up against this for the rest of my life, and I think in that job I worked in the equality unit of that business, so for me that was kind of like, well, if they can't get it right, who is going to get it right? Who's ever going to get it right? And even things like online on Twitter, I do get pile-ons sometimes, I do get ignorant comments. I had someone recently say something like, if your neuro-untypicalness can't handle the heat, stay out of the kitchen. And I'm well aware that I'm going to be up against these mechanisms for the rest of my life. That's just how it is. There's no way that we're going to overturn decades and decades of anti-disability narratives before I'm gone. So I know that I'm going to experience it forever, and that is very disheartening, but it's also, it ignites my passions, and this is what I'm passionate about. I want to make change, and we're never going to change it unless people stand up to it. So I think I'm much more resilient against it now than I was previously, but I think it's taken me a little while after the diagnosis to build that resilience and to really find my feet as in this identity as well. I feel like all I do is shout about autism and women and girls. It's like my whole niche now is just autism. I feel very passionate about it because a lot of my life was lost and wasted to misdiagnosis, and I went through a lot of adversity that I didn't need to go through, and it's not an uncommon experience for autistic women and girls. So straight away, so I was diagnosed, this was actually before I was diagnosed, but the month after I sort of decided this is what it is, I was appointed to the board of an autistic women's charity, so I do policy work for them. At my own job in NHS Lothian, I'm the chair of the Disabled Employee Network, and through that mechanism I have rewritten the equality and diversity training for NHS Lothian staff. I'm also rewriting the neurodivergence training and autism training. I spoke at the NHS Lothian Leadership Conference on my story and shared what I'd been through, and I've actually presented to the Global Goals Summit over the General Assembly on neurodivergence in women and girls. So I've taken the message international now, and I will continue to do so, definitely.
Do you feel supported by the wider neurodiversity community?
Definitely. Actually, I owe a lot to the wider neurodivergent community, because it's through posts on Instagram and Twitter that I really started to identify with being neurodivergent, and it was sort of like a chain reaction. It was like I had sensory overload, I googled sensory overload, and I thought that's exactly what that was. I then searched that on Instagram and found other posts, and then from there I found this other hashtag, and I would just click through, and there were so many informative posts about behaviours that I've been displaying my whole life but would never have in a million years thought were autistic presentations, because I didn't know anything about autism in women and girls. Actually, my little cousin is autistic, he's a boy, and he is very, very different to me, and so in my head that's what autism looked like, and so I think I gaslit myself for a long time, and the autistic community online really helped me to understand myself and to find myself in this identity and to be able to identify confidently with it. It's very rare that I'll see a post about autism now or autistic presentations and not identify, and it really helped me to make sense of things.
What are your wishes?
I think just peace and stability. I think my life has been there's been a lot of ups and downs. I've tried very hard over the years, no matter how difficult it got. I've fought very tenaciously to be where I am now, but it's been a very difficult journey, and I'm finally at a place where I'm very settled in my job, I'm very settled in my home, I have a good life, and I want to see that continue. I want to enjoy my life. I don't want to have to continue to doggy paddle my way through life just to exist every day. I want to start living and to enjoy my life, and I think being stable is something that's very new to me, and it's something that I'm very keen to keep a hold of. I think the main thing that I have had that has really helped me, I mean, I don't have any major reasonable adjustments in writing. I think it's very difficult to accommodate an invisible disability because there's no desk or chair or anything physical that can help. It's working practices. It's being able to start and finish at different times. It's being able to stagger your working times, being able to take extra breaks. It's being able to work from home or work from the office, or having a bit of flexibility. And that's one thing that the pandemic has made me realise is something that I really need at work. And part of the reason I failed at work so badly before I was diagnosed was because I worked in places where there was no flexibility. It was 9 to 5 and you had to be there for 9 o'clock, and you couldn't be late, and you couldn't work anywhere else, and you weren't allowed to work from home, and that did not suit me. And I think the difference that it's made to me, being able to be flexible and to choose where I work and what time, has made me a much more effective employee. And I think most neurodivergent people would agree with that we don't operate in the same way, and we have these workspaces that are designed to give off the most productive day ever, and everyone's supposed to produce everything at the same time and at the same pace, and it's not realistic. I think most neurodivergent people would really benefit from a flexible space.
What made you come forward for this documentary?
I think my mission in all of this is to raise awareness, to put myself in front of other people who are maybe going through the same things that I went through, who are also maybe sleeping in their cars because they're ostracised from their friends and family, and who don't know what's wrong, and who are desperately seeking answers that they just don't have. And if I had been presented with this with someone like me much sooner in my life, I would have made the connection. And I think it's very important that we get that message to young people, to young women who are struggling and who don't have the answers and who are being let down by services. Because, like I say, having that influence for me would have changed a lot and would have got me my diagnosis much earlier.
Credits: Dr. Anica Zeyen, co-director, narrator and interviewer; Kelly Given, interviewee; Way to Be, co-director. The British Academy funded this project. Copyright 2023, Dr. Anica Zeyen. All rights reserved.